Good morning. I guess it's afternoon now, right? Everybody ready to go home? Getting close to that point. I'm Steve Moore, like I was introduced, and this is Mark Kastleman. We're excited to be talking to you guys today about addiction and what works and what doesn't. Like the program said, this is going to be a really raw and real and honest discussion today. We're here not just as therapists who've been treating clients for decades now, but more importantly, we bring a knowledge base in terms of struggling with addiction and addicts and successful recovery. Mark will talk to you a little bit about his journey in just a second, but I'll go ahead and just give you kind of the quick 2 seconds of what pulled me into a situation that many of you probably find yourselves in. So at 13, my dad died in a plane crash unexpectedly, and I was angry with God. I was angry at my family. I was just angry in general. I felt a lot of shame. For some reason, as a 13-year-old, I kind of felt like I somehow had played a role in the whole thing. And then I discovered pornography and masturbation. And my whole world changed because for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, all that stuff went away. And I felt normal, and I felt loved and wanted and happy. And I was one of those that was kind of instantly hooked into sexual addiction. My addiction progressed pretty rapidly from that point on. Very quickly, I got pulled into all sorts of other behaviors, and I went through kind of this never-ending pattern of trying to quit, using willpower, struggling, finding a little bit of success for a few weeks, maybe a month or two, falling back in, and never really getting anywhere with recovery. All the while, just those same feelings of being angry with my higher power and other people around me, with my family. I was really emotionally reactive. I was very isolative. That all continued on through high school. After a religious mission, and then when I got married, I felt like I'd finally beat this. I thought to myself, well, I can finally have sex, so I'm going to be good to go, and I should be fine. And it was that way for about a year, and then looking back, I realized that, I was actually my addiction had found a new way to kind of manifest itself. And through a series of different events, I went to school, in part I wanted to become a therapist, but honestly, school was like really expensive therapy. I was trying to figure myself out as much as I was anybody else, and so went to school for this, and then the rest is history. Became a therapist. I've owned Ascension Counseling for 5 years now, and work with addicts, spouses, and couples all day, every day, struggling with these issues. For you teens out there, it's important to know that I can reference from where you're coming from. The pain and the isolation that comes with this addiction and the shame can be overwhelming, and being caught in that never-ending cycle is very destructive, and we're excited you're here today so we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, my turn? So my story is similar to Steve's. I grew up in the pornography production capital of the world, a place called the San Fernando Valley, California. Any Southern California people here? So I was a tall, skinny kid, very shy, very kind of socially isolated. I grew up in a family that had a lot of mental illness. I like to say I got the mental illness grab bag all combined in me. So I had depression, anxiety, ADD. I had Tourette's syndrome as a kid, just all the things you can imagine, plus the general awkwardness and shyness and difficulty of growing up as a teen. And there in that very sexualized, pornified culture, I was introduced to pornography by an uncle. And at a very young age, I got hooked into it very quickly because it became the go-to escape place for all of my troubles. And I didn't know the brain science about it then that I do now, but it's very much a drug. It operates just like any other substances that we turn to for escape and soothing and to cope with life. So I got trapped in that very quickly. And that really began a journey for me that lasted more than 30 years of overcoming and falling back in, roller coaster ride up and down. And I became so exhausted and desperate from that process that at one point I actually came close to taking my life. And out of that process, I got involved with recovery, got involved with the mental health field, switched my careers completely from the financial world to the mental health world, because I just had to do whatever it took to get well myself. And once I saw how that was possible, I had this very deep desire to help others do the same thing. So for teens who are here, I know what it's like to be caught up in this stuff through your teen years and your young adult years. And I get so the reasons why we do that, why we turn to it. So hopefully today Steve and I can share some things about our journeys and what we've learned about what works and also especially what doesn't work.
Absolutely. So we're excited to be here with you today. Just to give you kind of a breakdown of what we're going to do, we're going to go through some pretty quick slides on just some real down-to-earth, ground-level knowledge of, like Mark indicated, what does not work, and then what we recommend that you replace it with in terms of getting on a good path towards finding some real lasting change. The fact that you're here tells me that you either have a relative or somebody that you care about or you yourself are struggling, and we want to help you break out of that cycle that Mark and I churned through for way too long so that you guys don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started, and after that, we're planning to take the last 20 minutes or so to do a Q&A with you guys. I don't know what your experience has been in the past, but Mark and I truly are as open of books on this subject as can be. Speaking for myself, and I think for Mark, there is no topic that's off limits. So please ask. If you have questions that come up for you, either that you brought with you or that you want to, or that come up during the program, let's talk about them. So first up, what doesn't work? Trying to change by going it alone. Anybody in here tried to change by going it alone? Anybody willing to own trying to change going it alone? Okay, very good. Most of the clients that I work with, at some point in time, usually for the majority of their time trying to get better from this, try the go it alone method. And I was raised that was very much the case for me. I was raised in a very conservative culture, and in the culture that I grew up in, I was taught, and the culture kind of taught me, more or less, that when I had problems or issues, it was my job to fix them. And I figured very early on that I got stuck in this mess because of me, and that it was my responsibility because of that to get me out. And that is part of what kept me trapped for so long. What I know now, as a therapist and having done my own recovery and having finally found successful recovery years ago, is that this addiction is literally an attachment disorder. Among the other things that it does is it's the brain's and the heart's way to find connection, to find love, to find acceptance, all of those things that kind of fall under that guise of connection in a really dysfunctional, very destructive, very unhealthy way. And pornography is just one way in which that manifests, and usually is a bit of a gateway, if you will, to other behaviors down the road. What we know works, by contrast, is I always use a quote from Johann Hari. He's a researcher and a publisher, and has a really famous quote. The opposite of addiction, he talks about, is not sobriety. Sobriety is important, and it's critical, and that's something we should all shoot for, but the opposite of addiction really is connection. If you want to beat this disease, you have to get into, or whatever you want to term it, right? If we're calling it a disease or just a struggle or whatever terminology works best for you. But the only way that I know of and that I've ever seen anybody really break out of this cycle is by finding healthy ways to connect, to be open with people, for them to be open with you back, finding people that you trust and that are willing to hold your story and that you can rely on, so that you have somebody to bounce things off of, talk to about struggles. And we're going to talk about resources and groups and what to do down the road. But finding that connection anywhere that you can. This addiction, we wrote a book called The Pornography Paradox, and one of the paradoxes of pornography is that it bills itself as connection while giving you the opposite. For 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes, you feel connected. But then, as many of you have probably found out, after that, what follows? Hours and days of guilt and shame, and I hate myself, and nobody would ever love me the way that I am, and all of those things that we get caught up in. And the clicker, there we go. It is working.
So one of the things that's really a big part of this addiction, it's very shame-based, and shame really says, not that I've done something wrong or I've done something that I regret, but shame says I am something wrong. I am bad. I am worthless. Right? It's an identity. And this involvement in illicit sexual behaviors and outlets tends to lead us down this path of really deep shame. And I remember as a teenager how much shame and regret and guilt that I would go through anytime that I would participate in these behaviors. And I would come out of it, well, I would go into it with a great need, right? This need to cope with depression, with anxiety, with with shyness, with all the things that were going wrong in my life, difficulties at home. And so you turn to this to get that connection and that feeling of worth and soothing. And while it feels good, as Steve says, for a minute, when you come out of it, you feel more disconnected than ever. And so one of the things I've learned that is an enormous help is to begin to focus on this concept that I am not my addiction. I engage in these behaviors for reasons. There's a reason why I go there. And if we can start to separate the addiction and the behaviors from the identity of the person, that is a huge part of starting on this path to real recovery. I like to say, we say I'm not my addiction. I like to say I am not my brain, right? Addiction is very much based in the brain. And it's based on our perceptions. It's based on habits that we form over the years, on what brings us soothing, helps us feel better, helps us cope. And once the brain learns to go to those places as its favorite drug of choice, if you will, we learn to do that, it plants those habits very deeply into its neural circuitry. And now it becomes automatic. I feel this stress, I automatically learn to go to this place. And I like to say, once that stress is linked to that reward, and you bring those two things together, they become welded and very difficult to break apart. And so understanding this is all going on inside of this brain, this nervous system of mine, but it's not me. And from a belief standpoint, in my faith, I believe that we're something more than these bodies, right? When this brain of mine that has all these behaviors built into it is under the ground, 6 feet with worms crawling through it, I will continue on, right? My true, eternal, higher self. I continue on. So if that's true, then I am not my brain. There's something more to me. And if I can learn that something more, can step back and look at the thoughts and the urges and behaviors in this brain and begin to notice them and direct them and manage them, and start to have that separation, then I can make some progress. Then I can start to realize that I make mistakes, but it's not my identity. So stripping that shame away from this is critical.
All right, so this is probably one that falls in line with I can't do it alone, is this idea that I just need more willpower. So again, show of hands if you're willing to out yourself. How many of you have struggled with pornography use or acting out with pornography in some way and have told yourself afterwards, well, that really sucked. I just need to try harder. Anybody? I'll just try harder. Right? It's willpower. I got to want it more. I've got to really be invested in the process, and I'm not. Well, again, what we have learned over the years, and the research now backs this up, which was very different from when I was a kid, is that most of the clients that I work with, probably 95% of them, it is not a lack of desire or drive to be done with this addiction. And that is something, when we're talking about what doesn't work for those working with teens, we definitely would encourage you to stay away from the well, you just need to try harder next time mentality. It's a nice thought, and there definitely can be some application to that. But across the board, what we tend to see really work, and what really worked for me and for Mark, is that recovery actually has a lot more to do with the do's than the don'ts. We focus a lot in recovery on the don'ts. And at the beginning of recovery, that's appropriate. We're trying to get a person sober in their, with whatever they're dealing with, be it pornography or other issues. But sobriety, like I talked about before, is really just a gateway to a whole new way of living. It's a whole new way of existing. It's a whole new way of thinking. It's a whole new way of interacting with people. The only way that I can describe it, being in that old world and remembering what that was like, and in the new life that I live, is kind of like the Wizard of Oz, you know, the black and white section, and then it flips over to Technicolor. Looking back now, I don't think I was really living that much. And getting into the do's is much more important. As we get some sobriety under our belt and we give tools to clients, and we're going to give you some resources for that, we move very quickly into things like finding connection. Okay, we already talked about that one. Other do's are positive self-care, taking care of yourself in healthy ways. In what ways are you feeding yourself mentally, spiritually, emotionally? We live in this crazy world where 50,000 things are always taking our attention and begging for us to be here or there. And sometimes I feel like I'm just running around filling other people's needs. And what I have learned is that just like this isn't about skill versus will like you see on the PowerPoint, just as important is that you need to be healthily selfish in this thing. In my culture growing up, the term selfishness was taboo. But the reality is if you aren't taking care of yourself emotionally, for those of you who are struggling and there is now some sort of an addiction at work, I guarantee you your brain will take care of it for you because it already has learned a way, like Mark indicated. It's made these links between emotional pain and discomfort and lack of connection and towards these other behaviors. And so recovery has a lot more to do with not just saying no, and a lot less to do with just saying no, I should say, and a lot more to do with how do I meet the needs that my addiction is trying to fill in healthy ways and in ways that don't destroy my life, that don't hurt my self-esteem and image, that don't compromise my relationships with myself, with my higher power, with other people that I love and care about.
All right, yeah, let's talk about this one. So I grew up in I would call it a very religiously rigid home. I would even call it really a sexually shaming environment. So it was a real message that sex it's bad, right? It's dirty. In some cases, the message was it's even evil. And in my teen brain, I thought, wait a second, it's all those things, but you're telling me to save it for somebody I really care about. And that contrast, that paradox was really difficult for me. I didn't really understand how it could be both. So I think, and in defense of us as adults now, right, I have 5 sons, and so I understand what it's like to be a dad who's really concerned about your kids and whether they're protected from these things, are they getting involved? And so we want to give this message of really restricting those behaviors, but sometimes we do that to the extent that we start to send a message that there's something bad or flawed about this. And so I think the real important thing to remember is that sexual drive is not the enemy. What's really going on is these sexual behaviors, these outlets that we turn to are really a symptom. They're at the surface. And the real key for all of us is to begin digging under that surface to see what's driving it. What's underneath these behaviors? Why do I run to these places when I'm feeling stressed or lonely or angry or whatever the emotion is that's driving it? Why do I go there in the first place? So if we can start to get down below that surface and peel back those layers, you know, what's driving it? Trauma, pain, insecurity, my ability to cope, what's under there? And that takes some courage because it's hard to admit, especially when you're young, right? Hey, Dad, right, I'm feeling lonely. I mean, what teenager says that, right? Or I'm having some real anxiety in this moment. It's hard for us to express those emotions and even to get in touch with them. So if we can help each other to start to look at that, when you see a symptom, look beyond that symptom and say, what's under this? And get to the raw and realness of that as quickly as possible. And that's a big step in the right direction.
So what doesn't work? This thinking about after a relapse, well, again, I'm going to ask. I don't know if, well, I won't even ask. I'm not going to make you raise your hands again, tell you what. But I will tell you, for me, one of the big struggles with overcoming pornography in addition to other behaviors I was trying to conquer was that I had a really skewed perception of how change actually happens, both in the brain and in the heart, I'm a big believer of. And I operated very much under this mentality that every time I would relapse, right, with be it pornography or something else, I use that term relapse or slip or whatever you want to term it, I used to feel like I was just back at square one. I kind of pictured myself like slowly clawing myself out of this pit, and I'd make it 2 weeks, and I'd make it a month, and I'd make it, you know, and it was all about the date. And in some ways, the date was actually what tripped me up. I'd get to a point where it'd been like longer than I'd ever been sober before or free of this thing, and it would actually freak me out. The emotional strain would go up, and I'd actually relapse because of that, which is the ironic part. And when we're talking about this whole notion of I just need more willpower or try harder, it isn't about trying harder. It is very much about trying smarter and understanding that if I were to relapse, so I've been sober for about 5 years, and I was mostly sober before that, but my last use of pornography was about 5 years ago. And for me, if I were to relapse today, go home and do that today. I don't plan on that. I wouldn't recommend it to any of you either. but But if I were to go do that today, I know myself well enough to know it would be definitely a huge hit for me emotionally, and there'd be some things to work through. But me relapsing would not undo 5 years of recovery and experience and doing things different. It would not be a back to square one kind of a situation. The reason why we get caught in that back to square one place usually is with the clients that we work with is because they keep going to those old tools of trying harder, just those traditional things that we're told, basically using willpower as a way to get better. And good recovery is a balanced recovery. The reason why we call it addiction is because it's basically a label for my inability to stop a given behavior, right, despite emotional, relational, mental, spiritual consequences. So I just keep going on even though it's destroying my life. But if I can look at a relapse and I can say to myself, not just going to that place of shame and, I'll never make it, I'll never be enough, I'm never going to get there. And if we can choose to make that decision to start looking at it from a perspective of, okay, what can I learn? Because when you're caught in that shame-based place, you're missing out on an opportunity. When you have a relapse or when you're continuing to struggle, there's a message there. The silver lining to a relapse is that it points out holes, quote-unquote, in your recovery program. It points out holes in what you're doing to stay distant and stay free from this thing. And if you're able to look through that shame, and this is where therapists and family can be helpful, and look at it from that perspective, you can start to make changes. And that next time, maybe this time you went a week without getting pulled into the pornography trap. Maybe next time you go 2. When I have clients who come back in after a relapse, they always, I can always see it in my office. They won't make eye contact with me. They're looking at the floor. They're so down. I can see a relapse from a million miles away. And they think they're just going to get hammered on by me because I'm kind of a confrontational therapist. And what I tell them is I ask them, have you been using your tools? They say, yep, we go through it. And if they've been really doing their best and they've relapsed because of something we haven't identified, you know what I tell them? Great work. We found something else that isn't working, so let's work on that now because that is progress. It's important to keep that mindset.
Yeah. So, looking for the recovery unicorn. Once I find it, then I'll get better. I remember this was especially true for me. So if you were to go into my storage area in my home, what you would find is a whole bunch of boxes of all of these different positive mental attitude programs. Now, how many of you can remember back to the PMA movement, right? The positive mental attitude movement, the big rah-rah events, teaching you how to think different, right? How to pump yourself up. And I ordered all of those programs in my addiction years because I believed that the next one would be the magic program that would solve all of it. This is going to be the one. And so I'd listen to it and I'd get all pumped up, and I like to say I was like the recovery racehorse. I burst out of the gate, I'm super excited, I've got this, and then about 2 laps around the recovery track, you find the horse collapsed, dead. And then right back into the pit of addiction. So we keep searching for this secret solution instead of looking at the fact that recovery is this whole process. That in order to get lasting recovery, I have to start to approach it in a balanced way. Am I looking at the underlying issues? Am I really willing to peel back the layers and look at what is really driving this? And then very importantly, am I willing to do the work in order to start to go through the healing process to get better? And that was the tough thing for me. If I boil it down today as to why I failed so often, it was because really I wasn't willing to do the work. And recovery is hard work. I wanted an easier way. I wanted to just have something quick and fast, and then I could be cured of this and I could move on with my life. And I found for me personally, it just didn't work that way. And so we get to this place where, you know what, I'm willing to do whatever it takes, and I am willing to accept this as a way of life, something that I will do from now on, not just this end point I'm trying to get to, but this is how I live. So that's the mindset I find is very helpful. Let me get into this healthy living, balanced life, sort of this way of thinking, and just stay on that track and make progress instead of trying to get to this magical solution and end. I just never find that it works that way.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about resources for teens. because this is one of those topics that is kind of hard in terms of finding resources. And even as therapists, I will be the first to tell you that we're lacking resources and that we can definitely use more. Although it is a huge blessing that there are some big ones that have come about just in the last 10, 15 years that are huge for teens and the teen group. As many of you know, this addiction most commonly starts in the early years, usually between like 8 and 13 is what we find. And so let's talk about some of those resources that can help you at an early stage, because the earlier on you tackle and begin this process, frankly, the easier it is to get out of it for lots of reasons. So the first thing we've got up here is 12-step groups. Now, 12-step groups vary by anywhere from religion. There are lots of religions. The LDS Church, for example, has an addiction recovery program that they offer. Other organizations do the same thing. And then there are actual 12-step groups that are separate from religious organizations. Every group is a little bit different, and so we'd encourage you to contact the leaders of those groups so that you can figure out which ones are kosher for teens to attend versus not. Obviously, it's sensitive subject matter. But getting into a group as quickly as possible is critical. And I know from my own experience that going to a group is like the last thing any of you want to do. I would have rather, frankly, and this isn't a figure of speech, I would have rather died than gone to a group. When I was first starting out on this process, I was not that brave. The idea of going in a room and sitting with a bunch of guys and talking about what happens in the bottom half of my body just freaked me out. I did not want to do that. I had no desire. But as I've gone through and tried everything else, again, you need that connection. It's great to have a therapist, and we obviously advocate for that. It's great to have people in your life that love you and care about you, but you also need a place where you can go and be raw and real and honest and say, hey, I had a problem with pornography this many times this week, or I acted out in other ways sexually this many times, and get real and have people look at you and not be scared or terrified or kind of like, oh, that's way too much, that's TMI, right? You need to have people in the room who you can look at and say, yeah, that was me last week. This is what works for me. Let me share with you what works. So that's important. Fight the New Drug. You guys have, most of you, if not all of you, have probably heard of Fight the New Drug, led and founded by Clay Olson. Excellent organization that focuses on not working with just adults, but specifically teens as well. They have a program called Fortify, which launched a couple of years ago, which is absolutely excellent. Good accountability tool that can be a huge resource and a help for you. There are lots of other youth recovery programs out there. One popular one that here locally is one called Sons of Helaman, which draws largely on a religious doctrinal-based recovery approach that is very effective for the people that they work with. And there are others out there as well. But again, something facilitated by a group is actually really ideal because you get that benefit of working with somebody who knows what they're talking about, a therapist, etc. But then you're also in a group of other guys or women that get it and know what you're going through and can be there and support you on your journey as you support them in theirs. Professional counseling, preferably specialized. That I can't emphasize enough. It's important that if you're getting help with an issue like pornography use or pornography addiction, this is a very changing, evolving field, one that is really only essentially 30 years old in terms of major research being done. And so you want to find somebody who specializes in it. Certified sex addiction therapists, which I am one, are a great resource, but there are lots of others out there as well. You'll just want to kind of do your homework and find somebody who works with this on a regular basis, who can really give you tools that are going to work for you. So if you're going to put money into that process, that's where we definitely would encourage you to go.
Yeah, so just a couple of our resources real quick. You'll notice at the convention, Steve and I wrote a book together called The Pornography Paradox. It's really our journey in our faith as LDS men, what it was like to grow up as teens and young adults in our faith, to have this secret addiction that you're living while you're trying to portray this outward appearance of being, religious and spiritual so that everyone will love you and accept you, while at the same time you're living this secret life behind the scenes. And what's it like to go through that? And so we talk very raw and real about that in the book. But most importantly, what we discovered didn't work for recovery and what does. And so it's a very open discussion about our journeys. And then the thing that we're launching this week, we're pretty excited about, is our online program called Perfectly Broken Together. And it's basically the two of us getting on in front of a live video session each week to work with those who are suffering with this addiction, with spouses, with couples, and just getting very raw and real in our discussion about talking about what works, about the challenges they're facing. So that we're launching that, and it'll be accessible to everybody really globally. And so we encourage you to take a look at that. We just wanted to make this help accessible to everyone at a very tiny cost. For addicts, for example, it's $10 a month. So we're pretty excited to launch that. So let's open it up for some questions. We really wanted to spend some time to get some of your questions and concerns and what you're facing, teens here, or what you're facing as parents or leaders. So any questions that you have, we want to open it up to that.
It's a big room, so you're going to have to shout.
There's a question over here. Yeah, stand up
please.
And shout it out.
I can speak to that a little bit, and this kind of goes off of that last slide that Mark was talking about. I forgot it. It's upstairs in my bag. I meant to bring it to the presentation, but I have a client who he loaned to me. He's got a lot of eccentric stuff, and one is this. It's a shotgun shell that's made out of 100% pure silver. It's a literal silver bullet, and I use that sometimes in groups that I run. And what we have found in our experience, both with our own recovery as well as with working with clients, that there is no one thing that will help. In terms of building a lasting program. I don't know of a single thing out there that is just the one stop, okay, you've arrived, you don't need anything else. I definitely would recommend a little bit of what's out there all at a time if you can. Therapy and any of these modalities, it's important to note, work as well as you let them. I have been the client before where I've gone to see a therapist and I didn't go with an attitude of wanting to change. I went with an attitude of trying to placate my wife, get her off my back, and I was going to be the therapist in the room and tell him all the reasons why what he was telling me was wrong. So if you're going to go and be resistant, then it's going to be probably less effective. So I'd encourage you to hold off using that kind of resource until you're really in a place or your children are in a place to do it. But therapy can be excellent. 12-step groups, I can't recommend those enough. Like I said, I've been in recovery for about 10 years, sober for a little over 5, and I attend a 12-step group every week. Still. In fact, I am far more likely to blow off my church than I am my 12-step group, which may sound a little irreverent, but for me, that's what's been helpful. So we're here to be real, right? So that's I guess how I would answer that. Anything you'd add? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, different things work for different people. I would start with, like Steve said, real important thing. We can try to get people we care about into help, but if they don't have a readiness, if they're not willing to start to look at the possibility of changing, if they're resisting, and they're really only following up with those resources because you're making them, you're going to find that very little, if anything, is going to work. So I'm a big believer in starting to expose individuals to things that will begin to build that willingness. So educational resources. Start to teach them about what's going on. You're just it's not because you're weak or a loser or a lost cause. There's logical reasons why you get involved with this. Let me help you to start to understand how that works. Things to read, online resources to look at. As Steve said, some groups to attend. Start to engage them in a process that will begin to build hope and possibility and willingness. And once they get on that track, a lot of things are possible. But to waste lots of funds and energy when they're not there, I find is just, in many cases, a very frustrating experience.
And the downside to that, and we've seen this with all fields of addiction, not just sexual addiction or pornography use, but the problem is when you have well-meaning people in your life who push you prematurely into this, maybe some of you have experienced that, not only does it not work, but you end up expending those resources at a time when you're not really ready to change, only to have them not available when you are. And so definitely something to keep in mind. But that is where, like Mark said, wading in little ways is a great way to start because I think a lot of that resistance comes from not so much not wanting to change, although there are definitely those cases out there. For you, I don't think this applies to the group that we have here. The fact you're here on a Saturday speaks for itself. So what we usually see with the resistance underneath that resistance is that incredible shame and that lack of seeing how I could even change. because I've been let down and I've failed in my recovery so many times, I just don't see a world in which it would be possible. So anyway, I could speak to that all day, but we'll move along. Great question. Others?
Yes. So did you hear that question?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
You, me?
Yeah.
Okay. So resources for women admittedly are still somewhat catching up with the resources for men, not just for adults, but also for teens. The best resources around that I would encourage with young women, there are some really good online groups. We can talk after, because I don't have access to them right now. You're welcome to come by our booth number 12 downstairs, and we can chat. But if you're talking about some local groups, I know that the Sons of Helaman program actually has a program for young women as well as older women, who are young women and older women? Younger and young women. We'll just put it that way, right? That's a safe way to put it. What's that? There you go. Called Daughters of Light. And I've heard nothing but good things about it. That's probably the best resource that I know of locally, but I know that there are others out there. Do you have any others that you've got?
Dan, is LifeStar doing for young women? So LifeStar,
Perfect.
Dan Gray's here. So the LifeStar organization for young men and young women, both. That's a great resource.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Other questions? Right there.
What steps would you recommend for an addict trying to get the courage to tell someone for the first time?
Good question. Go for it, man.
Yes.
That's a good call. Yeah, absolutely. Go
Did
for
you hear it?
Uh-huh. Did you not hear it?
No, I didn't hear it
Okay.
clearly.
We're just, yeah, no, I'm outing Mark here. Okay, so, so the question, if I remember right, was what would you recommend as some first steps towards opening up to somebody? Is that correct? So that is a great question. That, frankly, is a daunting task no matter what situation you're in. Because of the culture that we live in, and not just the religious culture, but just a Judeo-Christian culture that we're all brought up in, unwanted behaviors, there's a lot of shame tied to that in our culture. And it's scary to open up to people. And let's just be honest, when you start throwing around terms like sex addict or porn addict or whatever, everyone kind of has an image that sort of conjures up in their mind, at least with people who haven't worked with this or aren't familiar with it. And so the biggest thing that I would say is who you find to talk to is critical. Take some time to open up about your story. It is sensitive material, and it needs to be somebody that you trust and somebody who can be there for you and isn't going to judge. I think that, and those kind of relationships obviously only are cultivated over time, so it's really hard to gauge where to go with that. Religious leaders can be a lot of help that way. Probably the best source, if a person's struggling with the shame, if they're willing to, that's where therapy can be really helpful, especially if they're seeing somebody that they know gets it. It's a confidential space. By law, it's a space where things aren't going to get passed along. They can just be them. Probably the biggest reason why clients come to see me is not because of my qualifications and whatever, but because of just my experience and the fact that they know that I get it. And for an hour a week, they can come sit on my couch and just say, life sucks and this is why. Just be them and not be whoever it is that they're supposed to be everywhere else. So that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's important to find someone that you can open up to, that you can have trust with. I like to say we're not really meant to share our stories with everyone and anyone. So whomever we share our story with, it needs to be someone that has earned the right to hear that story, either through their own experience or the fact that they've helped others, but they can have empathy, they can have understanding, they can be there, and I like to say, sit in the ashes with you. And so you need to try and find someone like that you can share your story. Yeah.
Would that be one of the reasons why you like the 12-step groups, is because you're there with people that you know you can have some co-confidence with and not worry about sharing your story and open up with first?
Yeah.
So what was just said is that's one of the reasons why, and I would agree with that, is that 12-step is effective, is because it is a place that, obviously you can open up to people more, but those meetings are anonymous. Being totally honest with you, when I went to my first meeting, I did not share. I don't think I talked. And I think somebody pressured me to say something. And I said that I'm Bob and I'm visiting. That's what I said. I wasn't even me. I wasn't even giving my real first name. So, and if it starts that way, then so be it. I don't think that that's a bad thing. You start wherever you can. The important thing is that it's not, I think, shoved or forced on the person. That I can personally attest to well-meaning people doing that in my life, and it actually just kind of increases the resistance for many. So that's great thought. Others? Let's see. This one over here. I'm sorry, we forgot about you, sir.
I love your slides, and it's great to see, what doesn't work, what does work. The question I've got is, can you speak a little bit from a spiritual perspective of recovery, what doesn't work and what does?
Okay. You okay if I talk about that?
Yeah.
So the question is, from a spiritual perspective, what works and what doesn't work in recovery? So like we talked about, we're an open book, so here we go. So my experience growing up in my faith was, like I said, I operate a lot under that cultural dynamic of I need to take care of this myself. And things have changed, I will say, dramatically from when I was young to now, like 180 degrees plus in terms of resources and things. But I met with many ecclesiastical leaders while I was growing up who were all very caring people and very well-meaning and did their very best to help me, but had very little training. And at the time, there weren't many resources, honestly, when I was younger for this. They were virtually non-existent, in fact. And so for me, I got caught very much in a trap of I would do those things that my religious leader was having me do, but then I wasn't pairing it with anything else, any other tools. And I would find some success, but not a ton. It would be limited. And for me, that developed into a very dangerous cycle that some of you may have found yourself in. For me, that religious dichotomy between who I was presenting to people versus who I actually was inside grew and grew. I was voted by I was on my high school's LDS seminary council. I was voted by my graduating class to be most likely to become a seminary teacher. And all the while inside, I was struggling with this. And that kind of culminated after I got married and did a religious mission to where a very dangerous line of thinking was developing in my head. Because the more I tried these things that people that I trusted were telling me to do, and the more that they weren't working, I was led more and more to one of two conclusions. Either that this whole religious stuff that I've believed in forever is garbage, and that my higher power really doesn't care, which is scary. Or that I'm so broken that I have somehow overridden that concept that I've learned growing up in terms of being redeemed or redemption or being able to change. And both of those were very, very negative mindsets. And it was what was helpful for me, and what I encourage religious leaders of any faith all the time to do is spirituality has a huge part in recovery. Mark and I, as you read in our book, we've both kind of been to one extreme to the other. And what we have found to work isn't by just going straight to psychology and using nothing but psychology terms and learning about the addiction cycle and all of those things. Thank you, Dan. 10 minutes. It wasn't just that, but nor did it happen in just a hyper-spiritual place for either one of us either. Now, that may be different for some of you, but for us, that never worked. For us, it was a balance. That's what we try to work with clients and in our program, is a balance of bringing those spiritual components and those tenets together and your higher power and faith and all those things, and pairing it with the best research in psychology and clinical experience. And when you can do both of those and you get information about how shame works and all those other things, that's probably the most important part. That religious shame piece is one that you could probably tell I could talk about all day. So feel free to stop by the booth or give us a call. Our cells are both available on there, but those would be some thoughts. So, other questions? Right here.
You've used the word addiction a lot.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what is addiction and what is not an addiction? And just define that word for us a little more. Are you using that very deliberately or are you using that very generally?
So the question was, can you talk a little bit about what addiction is, addiction versus not addiction, right? And we're using that terminology a lot. What are we meaning by that?
Correct.
Okay. Go ahead.
You want me to take that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
I'm doing all the talking.
Yeah, you can find a lot of definitions of addiction. There's a lot of argument out there in the space. In fact, there's a pretty prevalent movement in the psychology industry that claims that there's no such thing as a pornography addiction or sexual addiction. So for me, the definition has become very simple over the years. If I'm engaging in a behavior that I know has negative consequences and keeps creating catastrophe in my life, and yet I continue returning to it over and over again in spite of those consequences, for me that now enters the realm of a simple definition of addiction. You can call it a compulsion, you can call it an obsession, but if I'm doing something that's contrary to what I know will bring me happiness and peace and success, and I keep doing that behavior, to us that's addiction.
Yeah. And just to kind of add to that, and I know Mark feels the same way about this, we use the term addict with people struggling with addiction, but we do it more or less because there's not really a term that's better, because that sort of implies a label. And like Mark talked about, we're big believers that the addiction is separate from the person. When I'm working with somebody who's dealing with any unwanted behavior, 99% of the time, they're in a good place, healthy headspace, and have no desire to be in that place. But it's that other 5, 10, 15, 20% of the time that kicks in, and it's something completely different. And so separating those two, I think, is important when you're talking about. Addiction is not a label, I believe, personal opinion, gospel according to Steve. Addiction is very much an attribute of a person, just like any other attribute, good or bad, and it does not make me any one thing, if that makes sense. So, other questions? These lights, man, I'll tell you. Oh, man.
There's some over here.
Oh, perfect. We got someone standing. There you go. So the question is what can you do or say in terms of initial conversations with children or youth about and address this issue in such a way that doesn't cause them to get pulled back in, right?
Or just make it so that they have tools to not get pulled back in. Because we as parents need to be empowered to know they're going to come to us and say, okay, here's what happened, here's what I saw, but now what do we do about it, right?
Yeah.
We can stop it from coming in our home, but what about what's happening inside of them?
For sure, for sure. I guess I can talk to that for a second. So for me, growing up, the one thing that would have been helpful, and I don't think my mom would have done this, but I operated under a premise of just feeling like I'd be judged or I'd be told that I was bad or evil or, right? Again, going back to that religious piece, and I'm not blanket statementing anything, but just in my own experience, I somehow picked up somewhere along the way, it may not have even been intentional, that this religious component, I was very much raised on the don't do it because it's wrong kind of model. And it's not to say that that's not the case. But for me, and what we see in what I've seen in my clinical work is that those external motivators aren't long-term motivations for lasting change. Not judging a child when they come is a huge piece. But just as importantly as that is helping them to see what's in it for me. It's that healthy selfishness that I mentioned briefly. Let's while we're having that conversation about why this is wrong or right or whatever we want to term it, it's important just to balance that conversation and have that conversation, but to balance it with what is this costing you, right? What would be the benefit of being done with this for you? Is it something that you want? Because people come into my office all the time externally motivated, into Mark's office. As much as I would love to say that people come into my office and just say, I didn't have anything else going on Friday, so I thought I'd come and get a little therapy just to kind of, up my game a little bit. That never happens. People show up in my office because their marriage is on the line, their, X, Y, or Z thing is happening, and yeah, I don't know what else I would add to that other than just that concept of needing to have a place where you can go and where either a parent or a leader or whoever it is isn't going to fly off the handle, so to speak, and they're just going to be able to say, let's talk about it. And so a big part of that is being comfortable with the subject matter. Sorry, I'm talking a lot, but my experience, I grew up, I remember when my dad had the sex talk with me. And I remember I was like 7 or 8, somewhere in there, maybe 10. It was probably 10. And he took me in the back room into my parents' room, which you only went into if you were in trouble. So it was just kind of weird right off the bat. And sat me down, and he said all the right things. If you've got a problem or an issue, please let me know. My dad was the chief financial officer for a major company, and I'd seen him talk to people about really difficult stuff. He served in lots of different organizations. And I don't remember anything that he said in that conversation. What I do remember is that he was more uncomfortable than I had ever seen him ever in my entire life. And I remember thinking, even though he said and did all the right things, the one thing I walked away from is there is no way I'm telling him about any of that, because that was weird. I did not like that conversation. So that's what I would say.
And I would add to that, it's important to not just to wait for these crisis events, but it needs to be something that we're dialoguing about in our homes on a regular, everyday, natural, normal basis, so that it's not a big thing for them to come and talk about it because it's something that you've been doing all along. Yeah.
Totally. How are we doing on time, Dan?
Time's up. All right.
Perfect. Thanks for being here with us today, everybody. Appreciate it.